I just want to pick up on what Ed was saying. I think you've been given a really excellent sense of how change is happening in the region. I can remember all those years ago when I was studying at Wits and doing my honours degree, and that my dissertation was on the integration of infrastructure in the SADC region. It still had 2 C's in the JCCI in those days, as a means of creating greater regional integration. At that stage, the executive director of the SADCC was a Zimbabwean guy called Simba Makoni. And he said, and I'll quote him, "It doesn't matter whether de Klerk or Mandela is in power in South Africa. The rest of the region needs to reduce its dependence on South Africa's trade routes." And that still holds today. It's taken a long time, and right through the 90s and the early noughties, not a hell of a lot happened, as I'm sure most of you know. But I do a lot of traveling around the region, a lot of sort of leopard crawling through border posts and all sorts of things. And it's amazing how things have started to change and how quickly they're changing. And I think in many instances, South African companies tend to sit back and think, well, if things are lousy here, can you imagine how lousy they must be cross-border? And in fact, the exact opposite is starting to happen. We're stagnating here. We have a policy morass that doesn't want to sort itself out for virtually every industry and every sector. Whereas once you get outside of South Africa, a lot of change is starting to happen. And we're starting to see it more and more. As a result, the region is becoming less dependent on South Africa. I think Ed's illustrated that quite well, not just currently, but looking forward. And a lot of our clients don't like to look further forward than their next board meeting or their next annual report. Or they'll say, oh, but the price of copper's tanked, ergo you can't do any business in the DRC. We need to start taking a longer term view of our immediate neighborhood, and I hope to share a little bit of why with you, specifically as it relates to corridors. I've put up this first slide just because even though there is this global crisis, and we keep getting told about the global crisis and the downturn in investments and so on, investment in infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa has not declined in the last decade. In fact, even in the lousy years from 2013 through to 2015, it kind of maintained at a level. Now that's possible that it was a cyclical thing, that institutions like the World Bank, African Development Bank, and other bilaterals and so on have already had programs in place to support that development. But there is also, and I think it comes through in Ed's research and his presentation, that there is an understanding in most countries and a desire to get a bigger slice of the pie. And that slice of the pie is going to be at our expense every single time. So you can see just some figures that I took from a PwC infrastructure analysis and some of our own experiences, just how much infrastructure spending is going to increase. This report was done last year, so it's pretty current in infrastructure terms. But 10% growth a year over the next decade in infrastructure spend across sub-Saharan Africa. So $180 billion on infrastructure by 2025. Nigeria and South Africa will dominate that, assuming we have any money to pay for ours. But other countries like Ethiopia, you've just seen they've opened the Djibouti Addis railway line. They've just opened the light railway in Addis Ababa, which is a huge step for a country that most people still associate with the famines and conflicts of the 80s and 90s and so on. But Ghana, Kenya, Mozambique, Tanzania also looking good. So Mozambique and Tanzania are direct competitors of ours for goods coming into the landlocked, the hinterland of Southern Africa, Southern Central Africa, and Kenya is and will increasingly become so too. It really is starting to change the dynamic. So major increase in spending in basic manufacturing is also something that's come out. And we see this. We do a lot of work in the cement industry for companies here and for foreign companies that are looking to build cement plants in other African countries. We're currently tracking about 75 either brownfields expansions or greenfields projects in southern, east, central, and west Africa. and there are more of them. There's another one announced pretty much every day. So you've got that. Ed gave the example of the bagging of the fertilizer. We're going to see much more of that happening. The port of Mtwara and the link up to Lindi in southern Tanzania, German companies have signed agreements to build chemicals plants and so on. So again, as all of that starts to unlock, the reliance on South Africa starts to lessen, and we need to be aware of that. So we need to start taking a more strategic look at this, and one of the ways of doing that is bulking up on opportunities in key areas. The big Pemba Palmer oil play that looks like it's starting to happen again, and we're going to take a delegation up there quite soon, isn't the only thing that's happening up there. There's a hell of a lot else, and I'll get onto that a little bit later. The region is also going to be spending a lot more on utilities, with an annual rate of increase of 10.4% a year from now until 2025. Rail will need a lot of that money, but rail is a very political form of infrastructure, because users have to pay for it. Until you have all the roads tolled, they would rather use roads because they don't pay for the maintenance of the roads directly. And you also have, unfortunately, in most countries, at least a couple of ministers who own prominent trucking companies. And that's why the Addis Djibouti rail line took 20 years odd to get going, was because of the power of the trucking sector in Ethiopia. So those are some of the things. Power, a major thing. We've seen here, and in fact in every country, the need for power. Some of them are moving a lot faster than South Africa is on that score as well. Again, in East Africa for us is probably over the next decade going to be the key area of opportunity in sub-Saharan Africa, outside of standalone economies like Nigeria and Angola, and perhaps to a much smaller degree Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and one or two others, maybe Cameroon. But East Africa, pretty much from Botswana and South Africa's coalfields through to Ethiopia, is where a lot of investment is going to happen and a lot of opportunity is going to unlock. I remember when Tullow Oil first started drilling in East Africa, there were, it was an Irish guy, and apologies to anybody Irish here, but people looked at him and thought, he must be cooked. What is this Irishman doing drilling in East Africa? And he said, well, off the west coast of Africa, over 40,000 wells have been sunk. Off the east coast of Africa, which is next to the world's biggest oil reserve, only 400 have. So hell, I'm going to go for it. And Tullow obviously now have oil in Uganda, they've got it in Kenya, they're exploring in Ethiopia. Whoever holds the rights to the Congo's oil reserves will be exploring for that at some stage as well, I'm sure. But a lot of that money is going to be spent in Tanzania and here, but also in Mozambique, Zambia, the DRC, and on the west coast. So there you can see this hodgepodge of key corridors. Some of them are pretty well known. I mean, we've got all the corridors that Ed talked about, Nacala, Beira, Maputo, the big north-south corridor that everybody keeps talking about. The big extractors companies have been scared off a little bit because of the collapse in prices. They'll probably be a bit more reticent to just go gung-ho and develop them 100% themselves. But increasingly, as these corridors unlock, governments in the region are putting pressure, like we have here, for domestic inputs or for BEE companies to be a part of the process. So it is in other African countries, and there's nothing wrong with that. In Mexico, they have an indigenization program. When we hear it in Zimbabwe, everybody runs a mile. They do it in Mexico too. They do it in a lot of countries. And so the big project developers are now starting to demand that a lot of their suppliers are located in situ. And if you are then supplying into those suppliers, they want you there too. They're not interested in you saying, oh, it's okay, Jack, there's a flight from Joburg to Pemba in 3 days' time, and I'll see if I can get on it, if I can, No, they want you to be there, because if you're going to be part of that development, and these developments are not 3 to 5 year developments, we're talking 20, 30, 50-year developments. And again, it's not just the development of, say, that oil and gas platform, but it's all the infrastructure around it. Given, as you'll look here, even on the coast, in northern Mozambique and southern Tanzania, those are stranded resources because there isn't any traditional infrastructure associated with them. So you don't have major roads, railways, airports, or ports. That infrastructure has to be built before you can do that. Those of you who remember the building of Mosul will remember that they actually had to build a town for 5,000 people. They had to build the roads, they had to put in the water and sanitation, they had to put in the clinics to deal with the malaria before they could actually start building Mosul. In fact, they had to put in the transmission lines so that the equipment would work as well. So this is the kind of thing that starts to unlock. And the further away it is from South Africa, the more influence we see from non-South African companies who draw on their own supply and logistics chains and obviously then exclude us from that. There are a couple of interesting ones. Ed's already talked about this little area down here from Durban up to Maputo, the Katembe Bridge, which is under construction now. But then there's this one as well, from Cape Town or from Joburg all the way to Kinshasa. I was in Kinshasa last week, had a very good meeting with ShopRite. They're roading everything that they get out of South Africa, goes from their distribution centers in Cape Town and Joburg, through Namibia, through Angola, into Kinshasa. It takes them between 12 and 14 days, and they reckon they'd rather do it that way than have 30 days of shipping up to Matadi, and then it sits at the port of Matadi for 12 to 14 days. So, you know, that's opening, and this really could be a lifeline for us. A lot of the work that we've done in Angola and the DRC in the last 12 to 18 months, there's a real sense that particularly in Angola, the big retailers there, whether they're industrial retailers or FMCG retailers, want to source product from South Africa. They're really keen to do it because of the decline of the rand. Also, if Angola, and it's a very big if, because the Angolan government never really does things that they say, certainly not in the time frames they say, but they're supposed to be implementing the SADC Free Trade Agreement next year, which would then drop the import duties on a lot of South African products from highs of 30, 35, 40, 50% down to 5 or 0. So you can imagine, if they can do that, the guys are very, very keen to start using South African suppliers. So that is not an official corridor, this Cape to Kinshasa one, but it is one that I think offers a lot of opportunity for South African suppliers. In Kinshasa, the guys are really keen to start using that opportunity. I spoke to a couple of the forwarders and logistics guys up in Kinshasa. The border post at Lufu between Angola and the DRC is operational. There's only about 13 kilometers of untarred road on that whole thing. I've driven about 2/3 of the road in Angola through to Namibia, and it's pretty good except for one little section. How long it'll stay good is open to debate though. Now, given that about 5 years ago, I drove from Lobito through to Pombo in the Highlands on a magnificent stretch of road, and then it suddenly just came to a halt. And I said to our driver, what's going on here? There's the army, they're stopping you, they're saying, go left, and you go through this little town that you could see once had electricity, it once had tarred roads. There's nothing there now. They've got 3 ATMs which just gather dust because there's nothing they can do with it. They can't even get diesel in to run them properly. I said, so when are they going to tar this 40-kilometer stretch? And he said, with no hint of irony or malice or anything else, when the president needs to use it. And that was pretty much 10 years ago, the attitude. But in Angola today, a lot of those roads that were either destroyed or were abandoned during the war have been fixed. And we're seeing this in more and more countries. That places we traveled to 2 or 3 years ago, where the roads were really lousy or the border posts were particularly bad, suddenly there's change. And that change is not going to all happen and then stop and decay and stagnate. It's an ongoing process. If you look at regional trade as it sits at the moment, and these figures are from last year, about 53% of regional trade originates in South Africa, and about 29%, this is by value, not by volume, is destined for South Africa. So still is this quite a high reliance on sea and road routes through to South Africa. The key east-west axis from Namibia to Mozambique, and we are starting to see more volumes coming through there, but it's still largely South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, with Mozambique, Botswana, and Namibia. But what we are seeing is Walvis Bay becoming a transit point. We did work for the government of Botswana in Zim last year, and they were importing car batteries into the country by the thousands, not from South Africa, from Brazil, through Walvis Bay. There's the mining industry. There was an announcement earlier this week, 109 trucks for the big new mine going up in DRC, coming in from Europe through Walvis Bay, nothing from South Africa. So we need to be cognizant of this is change that's happening. And every shipment that doesn't utilize us means that our suppliers are out of the loop. It means that there's this constant knock-on effect. Lobito could reroute to become the key port for the copper belt. You've got about 3 million tons of copper in play there. Walvis Bay is trying desperately to get that business, but at the moment they don't have enough backhaul to make it work. Their insurance costs are a fraction of coming down through Zimbabwe and South Africa, and that is giving them a competitive advantage in that. But they still need to work on the backhaul. But before Tenki Fungarume sold out, American mine, American management, they wanted turkey for Thanksgiving and Christmas every year. And the traders in Lubumbashi would import it, not from South Africa, but from Canada and the States. So we are starting to see already this lessening of dependence. And if you can start to get that 3 to 4 million tons of copper and cobalt every year, you then get 3 to 4 million tons moving back through Lobito, whether it's Angolan manufactured produce or whether it's imported. But that really is something that we need to look at. And the same situation as Ed's outlined in Mozambique with the corridors and the hinterlands there. There's even the opportunity to use Beira as an exit for the copper belt. So, again, if you look at from the copper belt, from the DRC side to Durban or PE, you go through, I think, 5 or 6 border posts. If you go through Lobito, it's 1. And the Angolans want to have everything pre-cleared in Kolwezi and then sent through, and pre-cleared in Lobito and sent the other way. So you're not going to have 5 or 6 border posts and crossings and so on. That just makes a hell of a difference. Time, distance, cost. We sit at the bottom of this big development, and unless we can start to compete, it doesn't look that great for us. So the industrial parks, development hotspots are part of this process, and this is where South African companies need to see and decide whether they're going to be part of that or whether we're going to try and develop business from here. And I can tell you that increasingly companies to the north of us are not interested in doing business here. They can find the same products anywhere in the world. They can find the same services anywhere in the world. And if they have to wait for 2 weeks for a South African supplier to bother to get back to them, then they will go to China. And we see that right throughout Southern and East Africa. There you can just see some of those development hotspots. The Copper Belt, Walvis Bay is the SADC gateway. The Walvis Bay Corridor Group are a very, very dynamic and aggressive company. Johnny Smith and his team do a wonderful job of promoting themselves. And that is, for years and years it was talked about, it's becoming a reality. And the same thing happens with all of these other things. And you can see there the Rovuma Basin. It's not just the oil and gas there. Syrah or Syrah Resources of Australia are developing the world's biggest graphite mine, possibly up to 300,000 tons of graphite a year. At the moment, they're going to truck it down from Cabo Delgado province to Nacala. But if the graphite price does what they think it will, and if it makes sense, they will build their own rail line and export terminal. So, again, are we engaging with them sufficiently? Are we in that space, or are we just watching it from the outside? And then again, the oil and gas developments from Lindi to Pemba. Already seeing local companies looking at integrated operations, possible links through to Malawi. So it's starting to unlock that whole region. The coal belt, as I've talked, all the way from Botswana through to Tanzania and so on. Even in a place like Kenya, at Lamu, they are looking at building a 1,200 megawatt coal-fired power station. Initially, the coal will come from South Africa, but they've identified coal reserves in Kenya, which will take that business from us at some stage. Why is this region important to us? And I think that a lot of us underestimate just how much business we do in the rest of Africa. If you look at the tripartite, and I've just put that up there because it looks nice, the whole sort of SADC, COMESA, EAC agreement, which extends up to Egypt, that region, and about 80% of our exports into tripartite are into the immediate SADC region. So SADC on its own accounts for about 25% of South Africa's total exports by value. SADC accounts for over 40% of all South Africa's value-added exports. So from a manufacturer's perspective, from an industrialist perspective, this is the key region for us to be operating in. Even in the bad times, it is mopping up what we can't sell in our domestic market and what we are just never going to be competitive selling into Asia or Latin America or into Europe. And it frustrates me that we have this obsession with BRICS and with China. Those of you who've been to China will understand, our guys sitting in Boksburg and Kempton Park and whatever, manufacturing their steel products are never going to compete in that market. So why are we trying to do business there at that level? And you can see there what we export to the tripartite countries in terms of machinery, mineral products, chemicals, vehicles, vessels, aircraft, all of these kind of value-added manufacturing products, many of which are destined for the developments along those corridors. But go to Lubumbashi, speak to the Turkish guy who's making concrete blocks. He can get cement from Turkey to Dar es Salaam cheaper than he can buy it in South Africa. He can get it cheaper than he can buy it from anywhere except Zambia at the moment. And it's only the link from Tanzania into Lubumbashi that is killing. Otherwise, he would be importing cement from Turkey for his blocks. Now that they're opening up that Pedicle Road, the bit of the DRC that sticks into Zambia, that may just be the thing that unlocks the ability for Turkish cement companies to supply into what is our backyard in the DRC. I'm sorry for if I'm being a little bit South African here for any foreign Africans, or other Africans. But that's where we sit, is that we are now being challenged right in our heartlands by foreign competition. In Maputo, the Portuguese contractors are importing gypsum plasterboard from Portugal because of the cost and service they get out of Johannesburg. I mean, for me, that is an absolute, it's disgusting, quite frankly, that we are so uncompetitive in a city that is a 4-hour drive away from us. So that's where we sit. And you can see again, these are Comtrade figures. It's all in billions of US dollars. And you can see just in the last 5 years. Now, obviously part of that decline mirrors the decline of the rand. But you can still see that even as global exports into the SADC region increased from 2010 to 2014, then took a big dip in 2015, ours didn't. Ours just remained flat. And a lot of those exports into this region were from other emerging markets whose currencies also performed badly. So it wasn't as if it was just us. And then on the flip side, if you look at exports from the European Union in expensive currencies, they still grew too. So we can't blame the rand. There's a lot of other factors at play, and a lot of those are domestic inputs and the lack of certainty here. But we are losing market share, down from 34% in 2010 to about 26% in 2014. It did bounce back a bit when global exports dropped. But we're simply not flying the flag properly. And as these corridors open up and as the focus is removed from South Africa, so we need to re-intensify those efforts. Whether you are in the logistics industry or whether you're a manufacturer, whether you're a supplier of services, you can no longer just rely on the fact that other Africans know South Africa. Once you get to Nairobi and once you get to Brazzaville, they don't know and they don't care. In fact, even in Kinshasa, they don't know and they don't care because they've got supplies from the rest of the world. So we need to be flying those flags. We really do. And if you, particularly in markets that have very little historical interaction with South Africa, and that would be anything from Angola upwards on the west coast, and pretty much once you get north of Dar es Salaam on the east coast, the knowledge of South African products is really, really shaky. And their attitude is quite correct. Well, why must we fly to South Africa to go and look for stuff? You guys want us to buy it? Come to us. But as long as our systems are not set up to do that, we're not going to be keeping those market shares. So there you can just see in another way how in 2010 our market share, not just in the SADC region and those critical hinterland countries, and those hinterland countries, if you look from Botswana, Zambia, southern DRC, Malawi, and parts of Mozambique, those are our traditional areas, and those are the ones, along with our customs union countries, that would be threatened most by the efficiencies or the increased capacities of the regional linkages that are being created from the ports inwards. So our key markets are the ones that are under threat, and we've lost market share in virtually all of them. There's the Lobito corridor, just to put it into context. It's not only about sending stuff into the copper belt and bringing stuff back out again. You've got Bombo, which sits kind of a couple of 100 kilometers, 300 k's inland, I think it is. It's allegedly a city of 2.5 million people. Hell, I don't know where they all are because most of the buildings are empty still. But, you know, there's a lot of cement plants being developed, a lot of industrial capacity, a railway line, a port, an international airport. So they're setting themselves up, just like in Nakala with the opening of the international airport, to try and attract investment and trade directly out of Asia rather than routing it through OR Tambo or Maputo. So that's kind of what you're looking at in that complex. Bearing in mind as well that about 80% of Angola's population lives on the coastal belt of around about 200 kilometers inland, so 20% of the territory, 80% of the population, and that really is where all their ports are and infrastructure being developed around. So, corridor developments, the opportunities, it's clustering at various levels. It's not just your anchor projects, it's your smaller ancillary developments. As I've said, companies that are located in those areas, or in at least the country of operation, benefit at several levels. You've got the in-market intelligence and access. Sitting in the bar in the evening at the Pemba Beach Hotel or the Nautilus down the road, and you're talking to the oil guys and what they're doing and when they're going to be doing it. You're talking to their contractors. You're talking to the local business community. You're picking up that ability to know if, when, or where the next big projects are going to come from. The push-pull from government and mega project developers. You'll see now that the big resource companies in Mozambique are actually starting to publish their local content and local procurement figures because they're under enormous pressure from government to do so. So having a partnership, and we chatted to some of the oil companies in Maputo earlier this year, they have databases of local suppliers. Unfortunately, many of the local suppliers don't have the ability to deliver the kind of service or the quality of service or product that they need. And they would happily have South Africans partner with them in order to get it to use that as a kind of a Trojan horse into those sort of projects. So as I've said already, project developers insisting that their suppliers are located within the project development space. The long-term development in extractives, it bulks up other project opportunities. For example, in DRC, if you look at what Tenke Fungarume were doing, I don't know what's going to happen with the new Tenke town. That Tenke Fungarume area it stretches from, I suppose, Krugersdorp through to Pretoria and a bit beyond, if you put it into a South African context. And they've only discovered 2 of what they think is 20 copper nodes. They want to build a new town because when the first guys did it many years ago, in 1996, there were about 10,000 people there. There's currently about 250,000 people in that area. And there's no sanitation, water, housing. It's a ticking time bomb. They've got a plan to develop an entire town and industrial space with logistics and trucking and pit stops and all this kind of stuff. It took a long time because every time they located a decent site, they did a quick geological survey and discovered a massive piece of copper underneath it. So, you know, but I don't know if the new developers will look at that. But that's the kind of thing. In Pemba, you're looking at exactly the same developments. You have to build hotels. You have to build accommodation for about 15,000 workers. You need to do the roads, the water sanitation, shopping centres, Oil guys work at a different level to dirty miners, so they want a 9-hole golf course at a minimum. It's all of these ancillary things that start to build into that, that there are opportunities for. And we need to be there because, as I say, increasingly you're either in the project or you're out. A colleague of mine took a delegation through to Houston last year to meet with the Anadarko procurement guys and had them with him. And the first question the guy said, do you have an office in Canberra? No. And then I'm not talking to you, I've got better things to do. That was it. Flew halfway around the world just to get kicked out. The other guy said, I've got an office there. He said, right, we'll sit down. We can talk. So that's probably quite an extreme example, but that's the way it's moving. So looking forward, we're going to see an opening up of Southern and East Africa away from the South African axis, and then increasingly away from South African sources of supply, whether those are goods, services, or whatever. You have to fly the flag